Today, I'm going to continue with Ben Myers's cross-examination of Ravi Jayaram regarding child K. And first, I just want to show where Joanne Williams, who was the other nurse on duty for child K when Lucy Letby was accused of dislodging the breathing tube that led to the child's collapse, even though it has been shown since that much of what Ravi Jayaram claimed was, at best, poor recollection, and at worst, I'll leave to your imagination. But I want to show you where Joanne Williams makes it clear that, unlike what Ravi Jayaram says, child K is, in fact, an active baby. So here it is. Myers asks Williams, something we've not heard much about, but I just ask you to confirm, is that a baby that moves can cause the tube to move? Williams says yes. So it's something which requires careful observation. Yes, Williams says. And the system can change from 1 minute to the next, in fact, can't it? Yes, but that's obviously why we put things in place to secure the tube, such as the hat and clamp that we've talked about. Myers says yes, but nevertheless, if a baby moves in some way, that can create dislodgement, can't it? Then there's a bit of overlap. And Williams answers, and moving the baby, yes. So Myers says, your recollection, you've told us, is that baby K had been quite active, in fact, hadn't she? Williams says, at times, yes. Myers says, at times, yes. Williams says, I've documented it. So there you go. The nurse who spent far more time than Ravi Jayaram ever spent with this infant saying that baby was active. And therefore, the dislodgement of the tube was not an unusual thing to have happen. So next, Myers begins to question Williams about morphine and about the process of giving an infant morphine and what it requires. And this is a bit repetitive, but I'm just going to show it to you because then I'm going to show you his questioning of Ravi Jayaram and how, again, I use this word about Ben Myers a lot, but how brilliant it is, how he once again weaves the truth into the questioning so that Ravi Jayaram has to admit an untruth that he had told in the past. So Myers says, that takes me to the question of morphine next. So let's have a look at the morphine if we could. Morphine can be used to relax the baby, can't it? William says yes. And it can be a sedative on the baby, can't it? Yes, she says. So a baby that's been sedated with morphine is going to be less mobile. Yes, less active. Yes, William says. And then Justice Goss steps in with this enlightening interjection. They are not mobile, he says. Babies are not mobile, even full-term babies. Mobile means moving around. Myers says, I simply meant moving. Goss says, there's a difference between being mobile and active. They can be active, but is that why you said active? So Myers then picks it up after a bit of an exchange where he tries to explain to Justice Goss that he wasn't suggesting that a 25-week baby was standing up from its incubator and walking down the hallway. He says to Williams, you explained to us, I just want to go back over this if you could help us, Mrs. Williams, that when a baby is first intubated, at that stage, morphine may not be given, but it may be when they are electively intubated. Is that correct? Yes, she says. Could you explain to us what you mean by that? So if there was a baby who was born of any gestation who is respiratory compromised, but maybe didn't need intubation at delivery, however, then while on the unit or the blood gases reflecting that they need some respiratory support, so actually we do need to intubate a baby, then that would be done in a controlled way with a procedure for an elective intubation. At delivery, it is done as an emergency. Myers says, right. So in the case of baby K, we know that she was intubated very quickly. She was intubated after delivery. And Williams says, yes. Later on, Myers says, would be a point when she gets morphine. Is that what you mean? Yes, Williams says. She wouldn't receive morphine at that point. No. Right. I'd like to look at the documents we have just to see when this can have happened. The prescription for morphine we have, I'm going to ask to put that up, please. This is a prescription. This is for a morphine sulfate injection. Can you see that at the top? And then a little bit later, he says, if we scroll down to see the administration details, this bolus we can see is scheduled at 5:15 on February 17th. But where it says administered, it's got 3:50. Can you see that? Yes, Williams says. And then across from there, your user details. Is that right? Yes, Williams says. And then the cosigner is Nurse Letby's details. Yes, Williams says. So when would that tell us that the bolus had been administered if we work with that document? I would have said it's 3:50, Williams says. Yes, all right, Myers says. That's the way that the bolus is prescribed. We looked at a handwritten document, which we're going to go to now, a chart. If we look at the top of this chart, it says neonatal variable dose infusion prescriptions. So this relates to an infusion being given, doesn't it? Yes, Williams says. If we just look down, we can see in the box to the left of the bold print, it says morphine sulfate. Yes, Williams says. There are a couple of mistakes that are made in the next couple of sentences, but basically he's saying that the doctor put in February 17th and that the time that he put in, that the doctor put in, was 3:50. So skipping ahead to get through all of these kind of verbal mistakes that were made. Myers says 3:50. Does that indicate the time the infusion would start? 3:50. Williams says potentially, or when they're writing it up. So there may be a slight delay because we make up, obviously, we get the infusion ready. So they're prescribed at 3:50. Myers says, so the infusion could actually begin a little bit after 3:50, but it's not going to begin before the prescription has actually been written out, is it? Obviously, it's not going to be made before the prescription is written up because they don't have the prescription to make it. So what he's suggesting here is that the prescription was ordered at 3:50, but that doesn't mean that it was ready at 3:50. So picking up, he says, because you need this to authorize the whole process. And Williams is confirming that at the same time they're overlapping. Williams says, yes, then it would be double checking the rate and volume. Myers says, so we have an electronic prescription for a bolus with the time of administration of 3:50. We've seen that. Is that correct? Williams says. And we have an infusion prescription with the time to start at 3:50. If we look at the intensive care chart that we went to, that says commenced at that point where it says morphine. Is that right? Can you see 3:30 commenced? Williams says, yes, but that could be, as I said, 3:45. It's just within that hour period. Myers says, yes, that's what I wanted to go to because this relates to the infusion, doesn't it? Williams says, yes. Myers says, and we have just seen an infusion signed by the doctor for 3:50. That's right, isn't it? Williams says. It's not going to start it before the prescription was written out, is it? So although it says 3:30, in reality, it's going to be between 3 and 4 o'clock. Yes, Williams says. So we've seen the prescription for the injection timed 3:50 and the entry in the IC chart for 3:50. Yes, Williams says. And we've seen the handwritten prescription for the infusion for 3:50. Yes. And the time period on this chart, you agree, fits in with that period starting at 3:50 for the infusion. What I've written. Yes, Williams says. And I'm sorry there's so much repetition here, but I just want to go through this so that it's very clear what Myers is getting at. Myers says, if we look at your note, please, let's go to the note to see what this says. None of this is asked critically. It's just to understand what lies behind what we've got. If we go to the central part and enlarge it, I'm not going to suggest that the way you've written everything down here is precisely in the order that it happened because you've done your best to recall everything at 4:48 a.m., haven't you? Which 4:48, of course, is an hour after all of this happened? So Williams says yes. But we looked at the entry for the morphine, and it's a little bit below the one we've got so far. Can we scroll down a bit? That says a number of things. It's got cannula inserted by Registrar Smith, commenced 10% dextrose, and it's got the amount there. It also says commenced morphine. And then there's a rate for an infusion, do you agree, where it says 20 micrograms, yes, per kilogram per hour, and then 100 microgram bolus given on intubation. Williams says yes. So that's the infusion and the intubation being the infusion and the bolus being described. Williams says yes. As you've explained, Myers says, those two things can be given at the same time. Yes, Williams says, you can give the bolus and then start the infusion, or the infusion's going and you're giving a bolus. All right, Myers says. We've seen timings of 350 for both of those items on the prescriptions. Do you agree? Yes, Williams says. So it's entirely possible they could relate to what was given to baby K on the re-intubation after the desaturation. Yes, Williams says. So basically, all of that to get to the point that while Jayaram had suggested that there's no way that baby K could have been moving around because baby K had been infused with morphine and given a bolus of morphine, which made the child completely still because of the sedative nature of morphine. It shows here that that infusion and that bolus was probably done after the event that Jayaram has testified to, that Lucy Letby had done nothing about the tube being dislodged and that he was suggesting she had been the one to dislodge it. So here, Myers is proving that the morphine happened after the event anyway. So morphine did not make this child still. And I wonder why Jayaram would have suggested this in the first place. Well, here's where Myers suggests the reason for that. Myers says to Jayaram, Dr. Jayaram, I'd be grateful if you could look with us at tile 65, which is from the clinical notes. It deals with what was done and when in that first section. It says morphine at 20 micrograms, is it, per kilogram per hour. Jayaram says micrograms per kilogram per hour. Micrograms per kilogram per hour. That certainly conveys the impression that morphine had been given prior to the desaturation, doesn't it? Jayaram says it does. And having seen the prescription chart, I would say that that actually didn't happen at that time. Myers says no. Now, I asked you a little earlier about the possibility of babies being able to dislodge tubes. You agree that it is possible. Jayaram says it is possible. What you were anxious to explain to the police when you made the statement I've referred to on April 17th, 2018, was in baby K's case, she had been sedated. Jayaram says that's absolutely correct. Myers says, therefore, she couldn't have dislodged it. Jayaram says, yes. I will absolutely agree that the timing of things, having seen that prescription chart, was different. And again, from the way things are recorded there, that's correct. She wasn't on morphine infusion. However, she was not a baby that had been very vigorous and trying to pull tubes out. Babies don't at that gestation consciously go for their tubes. And even though she wasn't on morphine infusion at the time, I still contend that the probability of that tube doing what it did at that time, at the time that it did, was unlikely. Myers says, you were at pains to convey to the police that it was unlikely because she was sedated. That's what you were saying, wasn't it? Jayaram says, that's what I thought at the time. Myers says, and let's be absolutely clear. You told them morphine stops the baby from being active and reduces the risk of tubes being dislodged. It reduces the risk, Jayaram says. The risk is small anyway. Myers says, you were explaining morphine would reduce it. Jayaram says, yes. And makes it less likely she could have knocked it herself. Jayaram says, and I accept now, looking at the timings of things, the morphine infusion was not running at that time. Myers says, and you also said baby K was a baby on sedation and was not moving around. Jayaram says, and I admit that at that time she wasn't, but she wasn't vigorous. And generally, had in retrospect, and you can accuse me of changing things, he says. But having seen that, I will absolutely accept that the morphine infusion from what has been written was not running at the time of the dislodgement. Had she been very vigorous, we almost certainly would have started that sooner. Again, I'm surprised it hadn't been started, but it hadn't been. Meyer says, you added that detail. First of all, you agree she wasn't actually sedated at all, was she? Jayaram says, from what I can see from those notes, yes. Myers says, she wasn't. You agree you told the police and emphasized that she was sedated. Jayaram says, that's correct. Myers says, you did that to support the impression you wanted to create that somebody else had interfered with that tube, didn't you? Jairam says, no, that's not why I did it. In good faith, I thought at the time that the baby was on morphine infusion at that time. But even if she wasn't, there was nothing to suggest in the way she was behaving up until the point that Joe Williams went to the labor ward that she was vigorous or fighting or at risk of dislodging the tube. And if she had been, this certainly would have been started earlier. Meyer says, it also follows, as it happens, morphine was not given at the point your notes appear to convey, was it? Jairam says, that's correct. Meyer says, I'm going to suggest what you have done is try to shift your evidence to try to take account of the fact that you didn't give morphine in the way you first said. Have you tried to shift your evidence to take account of that? Jairam says, can you describe what you mean by shift evidence? Meyer says, change it. Try and account for the fact that you can't blame this on morphine now. Jairam says, Meyer says, I'll be clearer. I suggest you sought to convey to the police that baby K couldn't move because she was sedated. Personally, I think that Myers was very clear in what he was asking, and Jairam was trying to avoid the question. That's probably a very obvious thing to suggest, but I thought I would say it out here. Jairam says, I think at the time when I gave that statement, that was one of the things. But even accounting for the fact that she wasn't on a morphine infusion at that time, she was a 25-week gestation who'd been born and needed resuscitation. And she was not behaving in a way where we were worried she might pull a tube out, as had been reported. And until that moment that Joe Williams left, she'd been absolutely stable, poorly, but stable. Myers says, in your evidence, at a relatively early stage, the prosecution showed you that prescription for the infusion with your handwriting. Jairam over speaks and says that's correct. And Meyer says, and your signature at 3:50 a.m., didn't they? Jairam says that's correct, yes. Meyer says, yes. You appreciate that trying to say that baby K can't move because she was on morphine simply can't be sustained now. Meyer says, what you have said now is, well, it wasn't baby K was not a vigorous baby, is what you have said now. Yes? Jairam says yes. Meyer says, as it happens, that's not an observation you included, certainly in your statement, is it, that she wasn't a vigorous baby? Jairam says no. What you said to them was because she was on morphine, she couldn't move. Jairam says, that's one of the things. Yes, I acknowledge that. And as it happens, before she was sedated, baby K was actually quite an active little baby, wasn't she? Define active, Jairam says. She could move, but she wasn't making any purposeful movements, and certainly she was not making any movements to actually dislodge the tube. To dislodge a tube, you need to be able to either grab onto it and hook it out, or be able to roll around enough. So babies can move their arms and legs, but she wasn't in a situation where we were concerned that the tube was secured. And this confuses me because Jairam himself and anyone who's looked at the notes states that because they were having a hard time intubating this baby, they chose to use a smaller tube. And so if the tube was smaller, and it was because the desaturation happened because the tube was so small that, as Dr. Shu Lee said, it was like blowing air through a straw in a hose and hoping to inflate something on the other end of the hose. So if this is true, why is Jairam suggesting that it's unusual for the tube to become dislodged since it was smaller? I'm not aware of the mechanics of this, so maybe I'm wrong, but I just thought to mention it. Meyer says, You deliberately misstated what happened with the morphine, Dr. Jayaram, to make it sound as if it was less likely that baby K, Jayaram interrupts, no, I didn't deliberately misstate. It was a genuine misunderstanding because I went from my notes, which obviously were written retrospectively. I wasn't aware because I hadn't seen that prescription chart that the morphine was not given until 3:50 a.m. I accept that. I don't accept that I deliberately made an error or deliberately did that. Meyer says, as it happens, not being sedated, baby K was perfectly capable of moving in some way that could dislodge a tube. Jayaram says, there's a possibility, but in a 25-week gestation baby who's 600 grams, the likelihood is very, very small. Here he is, completely going against what he's claiming before, which is that this infant was just in perfect health and that all of this happening was because of Lucy Letby's behavior. When we're talking about a 25-week gestation baby who is 600 grams, he continues, and the fact that it happened in that small window of time is also a concern. The window of time that Joe Williams left the nursery and supposedly Lucy Letby was with the baby, watching the baby. Meyer says, your suggestion she was inactive is a detail that you have put in once you realized you can no longer stick with saying that she was sedated by means of morphine. That's what you have done? Jayaram says, she was not a baby that was jumping around, that we were concerned that she would dislodge a tube. Meyer says, just pausing. If we move on the question of blockage. So here, Myers is shifting tactics a bit and moving to another aspect of this situation that shows that Ravi Jayaram is at best an unreliable witness. Meyer says, again, just pausing if we move on the question of blockage, are you aware the nursing notes make reference to there being secretions of blood and oral secretions? Jayaram says, I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of that. Meyer says, so you're not at any disadvantage. Let's have a look at tile 66, please. This is what we're looking at. Just in the center of that large body of the note by Joanne Williams, there's a line, large amount of blood-stained oral secretions. Jayaram says, yes. Meyer says, as best as we can understand, that appears to be when the tubes were first changed after the desaturation. But that secretion is in the back of the mouth, not within the tube, Jayaram says. As it happens, there's no reference to that in the note you made, is there? Myers asks. It's not really relevant in that situation, Jayaram says. Quite often, there can be blood-stained secretions orally. Babies swallow a lot of maternal blood. This can come up. Sometimes trauma can be caused when you intubate, but it wasn't a significant finding in terms of what was going on clinically, and it certainly doesn't imply that the endotracheal tube was blocked. Myers says, well, you didn't actually check the tube, did you? Jayaram says, no, I told you, I looked at it. I didn't document it, but I would have noticed if it had been blocked, I would have written it down. Meyer says, one of your interviews with the police was on May 26, 2021. I'd like you to have a look at something. We've got a large paragraph there in which you're talking about going through in your mind what could have led to this desaturation. You go through various possibilities. I want to focus on what we're talking about. If you go 7 or 8 lines from the bottom, read the whole thing first, if you wish. Jayaram reads it and says, I said I don't recall looking at the tubes. Meyer says, you say. Now, obviously, we did look down to see whether it was obviously blocked or whether it was in the wrong place. I don't recall looking at the tube to see if it was a blockage in it. But you go on to say it clearly wasn't working. That's what you said back in 2021 about this. Yes, Jayaram says. I don't recall, but I would have done. The other thing to say about a tube blockage is they tend not to happen acutely. You will again see as secretions in the tube accumulate, that ventilatory requirements will go up and the baby will deteriorate gradually. It can be quite quickly gradually. So the pattern didn't really fit with a tube blockage. Meyer says, what I would like to be clear about is this, Dr. Jayaram. You've said in your evidence there was no blockage and you checked the tube. Yes, that's what you said in your evidence today. Jayaram says, and I have said there, I don't recall. Meyer says, What you say back in 2021 was obviously we don't look to see whether it was obviously blocked or whether it was in the wrong place. I don't recall looking at the tube to see if there was a blockage in it. That's what you said? Jayaram says, I have to admit I've said that. Yes. Meyer says, we can take that down, please. I suggest to you, Dr. Jayaram, that the level of care for baby K on your unit fell below the optimal standard when you look across the board at what was done with her. Do you agree or disagree? Jayaram says, there are things that could have been done better and quicker. I wouldn't disagree with that. I suggest, Meyer says, that what you have said about Lucy Letby and the suspicion you say is generated against her incorporates details that simply did not take place at that time. Jairam says, I would disagree with that. I would disagree with that because, as I've said, I had an irrational bad feeling. And I walked in and found baby K deteriorating at that moment in time when minutes before, seconds before, there had not been anything to suggest that her clinical condition was changing. Myers says, I suggest that months, if not years later, you added details to what took place with Lucy Letby to support the things that were then being said about her. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Yet another example of poor recollection and strange details being added after the fact to prove a story that wasn't true. All there laid out by Ben Myers for the jury to see. But I will say that perhaps the length of that trial was part of the intention of the prosecution to create unclear details and evidence that were difficult to parse and difficult to follow so that the jury wouldn't hear the truth, which is that all of this is a concocted story and that many people had a lot to gain from that story being proven true, even though it wasn't. And here it is, laid bare before us, this lie that Lucy Letby is now in prison for.